Welcome to part 1 of my series going in-depth into Italian unification. This episode, we will lay down the groundwork for unification, namely the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna, as well as a cross-section of Italian society after Napoleon. Before we begin, I'm going to put a quick word in on liberalism and conservatism, since I'm going to be saying them a lot and their definitions have changed slightly since the 19th century. Conservatism at its base level is the preservation of the status quo, while liberalism is concerned with making changes to the status quo or upending it entirely. In the 1800s, this meant that conservatives tended to be proponents of stability, religion, divine right of kings, and absolutism. Liberals, meanwhile, lean toward constitutions, secularism, some form of representative government, and most importantly for us, nationalism. Italy was among the many conquests of Napoleon, so they got to experiment with all the fun stuff that came with the French Revolution. During their occupation, Italians got a taste of liberal ideas like republicanism, constitutions, and of course, liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Some Italians liked these ideas, and with time they'd only grow in popularity. But the liberal ideas were overshadowed by the fact that Napoleon started conscripting Italians into his army, which they weren't stoked about. Also, the French introduced less popular revolutionary ideas like secularism, which clashed with the Catholic lifestyle that many Italians lived. As a result, Italians of this period began feeling united, not as pro-Italy, but anti-French. It may not have been much, but the seed of nationalism had been planted. Napoleon would eventually be defeated by Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, known as the Big Four. They called the Congress of Vienna towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars to decide what would be done in the aftermath of Napoleon. They settled on one goal: contain the ideals of the French Revolution and liberalism in Europe. To do this, the great powers of Europe had to give and/or take away territory from virtually every country in Europe to create what was known as the balance of power. The goal was that if all the great powers were relatively the same strength, they would not be able to be dominated by a Napoleon-like figure. Ideally, the peace after the Congress of Vienna would last indefinitely. As long as nobody tried to create a new nation that could become a great power, that would pretty much destroy any hope of balance, but hey, what are the chances of that? Also present at the Congress were the other medium-sized powers of Portugal, Spain, and Sweden. The Big Four even agreed to invite France, just to show that they were committed to establishing the balance of power. This wasn't just to be nice, they really just were aware that without a strong France, it would create a power vacuum that could be exploited by another nation. The 8 great powers listed above were known as the Preliminary Committee of the Eight. Notably absent from this committee were any of the Italian states. In fact, the only Italian delegate at the Congress was representing the Pope in Rome. This was done on purpose. The Austrian diplomat at the Congress was a man named Clemens von Metternich. Although the primary objective of the Congress was the balance of power, every one of the major powers was allowed to expand into some area as a reward for defeating Napoleon, and Metternich ensured that Austria got Italy. The Austrians received direct control over Lombardy and Venice, and relatives to the House of Habsburg took control of the central Italian duchies of Parma, Modena, Lucca, and Tuscany. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies entered into an alliance with the Austrians, in which Austria guaranteed their independence in return for military support from Naples in any war. The Papal States, although independent, relied on Austria's army to put down any liberal revolts popping up across central Italy. San Marino was technically independent, but it was too small and isolationist to really do anything. This left all major nations in Italy reliant on Austria in some way, shape, or form, except for one. The Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia was purposely left independent as a buffer zone between Austria and France. As much as Metternich might have liked control over all of Italy, he realized that Piedmont was much more useful as a French speed bump in the event of another war. As the only independent power on the peninsula, Piedmont was the most likely candidate to become the unifier of Italy. Piedmont wasn't ready to be the champion of Italy just yet, and honestly, most Italians weren't behind unification either. The biggest demographic by far were the agrarian peasants, about 90% of the population. They tended to be loyal primarily to their families and local communities. Sometimes the word campanalismo is used to describe the feeling the average Italian had at the time. The idea was that Italians showed the most loyalty to their own town and its bell tower, above some grand scheme to unite people that spoke bad Italian according to them. Rural Italians were also deeply Catholic, which is important to unification because the church was very against it. The church taught the peasants that they were subservient to their kings and dukes because they rule through the will of God himself, and the Italians found it hard to argue with that. Desire for any political revolution among this class remained low. In the towns, urban peasants were less compliant. Italy was a pre-industrial society, so these workers were not working in factories, rather in small shops. They were dependent not only on their wages, but on food shipments from the surrounding farms. When they decided that their wages weren't good enough, or a food shipment was late or pricey, they would get uppity. So although this class was primarily concerned with their own well-being, they were more volatile and open to revolt. Above the urban peasants was a small middle class. They were most likely merchants or bankers, and they tended to have a university education, where liberal ideas were all the rage. This class was beginning to hear words like nationalism and republicanism, and they liked the sound of them. At the top, you had the aristocracy and the nobility. I probably don't have to tell you that this class wasn't too keen on unification or republicanism. Their main priority was to outcompete their rival aristocrats and noblemen across the border. So even if suddenly all the stars aligned and Italians wanted a republican revolution, they would still need to go through Austria, who wanted to prevent nationalism at all costs. For Metternich, it wasn't just about protecting that sweet Italian tax revenue, but the existence of Austria as a nation. This map shows how dangerous the idea of nationalism was to the Austrian Empire. If Italians could have their own nation, why not the Hungarians, Croats, Ruthenians, Poles, and Czechs too? If nationalism succeeded, the Austrian Empire would not. For this reason, Metternich convinced Russia and Prussia to form the Holy Alliance in 1820. The agreement between the powers was that whenever a liberal revolution broke out, the three great powers would combine their forces in order to put it down. As it stood in 1815, the Italian cause looked pretty bleak. Pro-unification ideas were not tolerated, so its proponents went underground. They formed secret societies, the most famous of which were the Carbonari. As their name suggests, they were founded by charcoal makers and grew popular with the middle and lower classes. They weren't very centralized, so their goals ranged anywhere from their monarch adopting a new constitution to a unified Italian republic. One thing they had in common is that they were prepared to fight for change. While most of Italy was Catholic, the Carbonari were an offshoot organization of the Freemasons, who were against papal control of, well, anything. They were aware that any meaningful unification of Italy would need to go against the Catholic conservative teachings of the time. Under Napoleon, Carbonari ideas had been encouraged, especially in Naples. It came as a shock to them in 1815 when their monarchs were reinstated, and now they had a mandate from the Congress of Vienna to meet any liberal reforms with hostility. This political whiplash would lead to the first major conflict of Italian unification. As it stood in the 1810s, there were tons of factors preventing a unified Italy. The Big Four and conservatism had successfully won against the French Revolution, but fighting against the liberal ideas that it stood for turned out to be more of a pain than Napoleon himself. The guy even predicted unification decades early. Italy is one nation. Unity of customs, language, and literature must, at a period more or less distant, unite her inhabitants under one government, and Rome without a doubt will be chosen by Italians as their capital. In my next video, we'll talk about when this begins to boil over in the revolutions that swept across the two Sicilies, Piedmont, Sardinia, and Austrian Italy in the 1820s. Thanks for watching.